There were big developments today in the trial of Daniel Penny. He's the Marine veteran charged in the subway chokehold death of Jordan Neely. Prosecutors agreed to drop the top manslaughter charge against Penny after the jury said it was deadlocked.
A few moments later.
But today, white supremacy got another victory. Today, the KKK, the Klansmen, the evil in America got another victory. They got that top charge dismissed. America shall continue to America and shall continue to place second-class status on black people.
They will not find a white man guilty of killing a black man in modern-day America. This is no different than Jim Crow. This looks like a picture out of the picture book when you look at that anonymous jury.
A few moments later.
But when you look at this, the reasonable person, there were many reasonable people on that subway train. The bystanders who thanked him, the bystanders who helped him hold down Jordan Neely, the woman of color who said this, they're trying to make this about race. Well, a woman of color, that's how she self-describes, said he is a hero. It was self-defense. He is only guilty of trying to help people. Those are the reasonable people on the subway.
All right, so there's some major developments in the Daniel Penny trial. Let me break it all down for you. Okay, so Daniel Penny is the Marine veteran who was on the New York City subway when another man, Jordan Neely, came into the subway and started acting a fool, threatening passengers, telling people he was going to hurt them, and he was ready to go to jail and kill people. Now, Daniel Penny and two other men restrained Mr. Neely before he was able to hurt someone. Now, after being restrained by these three men, Jordan Neely eventually passed away. Now, prosecutors allege that the way Daniel Penny restrained Jordan Neely caused his death. Now, so you can get the clear picture of what happened on that train and how much of a threat Jordan Neely was, here are some passengers on body cam explaining to you what happened right after the event.
The whole train was freaked out. He was either gonna like pull a gun and knife or like
said, I'm willing to die, I'm willing to die.
On cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses, the defense played police-worn body camera video of their statements to responding officers about what happened when 30-year-old Jordan Neely entered an F train on May 1st, 2023.
he scared the living daylights out of everyone.
That witness told the jury she's been riding the subway for over 50 years and has been threatened before, but this was the first time she said she was actually scared. She described Neely as resisting when Marine veteran Daniel Penny put Neely in a chokehold to restrain him.
Not a hard chokehold, just enough to secure him in the guy's floor.
She testified she left to go to the conductor and then also pressed an intercom button in the station to see when police might arrive because it had been a while. She also said she went over to thank Penny after. Another woman on the train with her 5-year-old son told the jury, "I've taken the subway for over 30 years and I've seen a lot of unstable people and this felt different to me." She demonstrated for the jury how she saw Neely lunging at people. When Penny took Neely to the ground, she said, "I felt very relieved because I was scared for my son." She was shocked to read in the paper that Neely had died because it didn't seem like his breathing was under distress.
So now, since we weren't on the train, we have these witnesses who tell us exactly what they felt when they were there. They were scared. They were scared for their safety. This mother was scared for the safety of her son. They said this was something that was totally out of the ordinary. This was not just an everyday ride on a train. And as you heard, the first woman has 50 years of experience riding a train. She said this is something that she's never experienced before. And the other woman had 30 years of experience on the train, and she said this is something that she had never experienced before. And lastly, these witnesses said something that was extremely important. They spoke about how they saw the restraint occur, and they believed that the restraint was reasonable, that he wasn't choking him but just holding him to restrain him from harming others, and that they thanked him after the restraint. Now, it's important to understand these are the prosecution's witnesses, essentially calling Daniel Penny a hero. And they're not white, they're black and Hispanic women who are lifelong subway riders. Now, before we get on with the rest of this video, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Ethos. What feat of strength or bravery could you be capable of if it meant protecting your loved ones? Could you lift a car, run into a burning building, fight off a wild animal? Well, thankfully, you don't have to fight off a tiger to make your family safe. Protect your loved ones in minutes with Ethos. It's an affordable life insurance that's quick and easy and all online with no medical exams. Think about all the benefits of having life insurance. How would it feel to know that your loved ones have financial support if something happened to you? They could use it to keep up with the mortgage payments, pay bills, or more. If you've ever applied for life insurance before, you know it's confusing, annoying, and tedious to say the least. Now with Ethos, you just have to answer a few health questions for a quote and apply for coverage at ethoslife.com/Nate. That's ethoslife.com/Nate. Ethos offers customizable coverage to fit your needs and budgets. Get everything done online without complicated forms, doctor's appointments, or waiting for results. It's term life insurance on your terms. Personalize your coverage to your family's needs and get your free quote at ethoslife.com/Nate. That's ethoslife.com/Nate. Now, because of public outrage, Daniel Penny was charged with manslaughter in the second degree and criminally negligent homicide. Now, Daniel Penny's defense obviously was defense of others, or what's known as justification in New York, essentially self-defense. Now, since this is a legal channel, I have to explain to you the difference between manslaughter in the second degree and criminally negligent homicide. So first, we have manslaughter in the second degree. This is an unintentional killing where the defendant knows that there is a risk that whatever action they're doing could cause someone's death. And the classic example is someone fires a gun into a crowded area. They didn't intend to kill someone, but someone dies. Firing a gun into a crowded area would likely lead to someone getting harmed. So this would be the classic example of manslaughter in the second degree. Now, for a recent example of manslaughter in the second degree, back in 2016, this NYPD cop was found guilty of manslaughter in the second degree because he was patrolling one of the most dangerous housing projects in America. Now, because of that reason, the officer patrolled the buildings while his handgun was drawn. Now, during one of those patrols, the gun accidentally fired, killing someone. It actually ricocheted off the wall. And this officer was charged and convicted of manslaughter in the second degree because the officer understood there was a risk of someone getting harmed when you're walking around an occupied building with a loaded gun in your hand for no reason.
The shooting happened inside the Pink Houses in East New York in November. Rookie officer Peter Liang and his partner were on patrol when Liang shot and killed Akai Gurley, an unarmed man. Police called it an accidental discharge. Liang and his partner were going into a stairwell from the 8th floor while Gurley and his girlfriend were a floor below. It was pitch black because the lights were broken. Liang, for an unknown reason, had his gun drawn. He was going through a doorway when he fired down the stairs, striking Gurley.
So in this case, the prosecution was able to prove that this officer knew there was a risk of walking around an occupied building with a loaded gun in your hand, and he was convicted of manslaughter. Next, we're going to talk about criminally negligent homicide. Now, where with manslaughter, you have to prove that the defendant actually knew there was a risk of death. Here, you need to prove that the defendant should have known that there was a risk. The defendant didn't have to know of the risk, but they should have known of the risk. Now, here's a recent example of criminally negligent homicide in the state of New York. This contractor was contracted to build a wall, but they cut corners. And by cutting corners, the wall collapsed, killing a 5-year-old child.
This has been absolutely devastating for everyone involved. Tonight, while the rest of that fence has been taken down, a memorial is now growing in its place for that 5-year-old little girl, with so many asking, how could this have happened?
The landlords who live on the first floor had just paid a contractor to put the fence in a few months earlier.
We did not climb on it. The fence just go down, but it's very hard to believe how the fence could drop like that.
Now, just to recap, manslaughter in the second degree is when the defendant knows there's a risk of death or serious bodily injury and ignores that risk and someone dies unintentionally. Where criminally negligent homicide is the defendant should have known of the risk and someone dies unintentionally. Now, one other important aspect of this relationship between manslaughter and criminally negligent homicide I need you to understand is that everyone who's convicted of manslaughter in the second degree is also guilty of criminally negligent homicide. And think about it. If I can prove, or the state can prove, that you knew of a risk and still continue to do that action and someone died, then the state obviously has also proven that you should have known of the risk. So everyone convicted of manslaughter in the second degree is essentially guilty of criminally negligent homicide. But it's not true for the reverse. Everyone who's guilty of criminally negligent homicide is not guilty of manslaughter. Now, also, it's worth noting that if the jury finds Daniel Penny was justified in his use of self-defense, then obviously he's not guilty on both counts. Now, with that understanding, let's look at the verdict sheet in the Daniel Penny case. Count 1, manslaughter in the second degree. It says, quote, if you find the defendant guilty of count 1, manslaughter in the second degree, then you do not consider and do not render a verdict on count 2, criminally negligent homicide. Why? Because if he's guilty of manslaughter in the second degree, he must also be guilty of criminally negligent homicide. So it'd be redundant to find him guilty on the manslaughter and guilty on the criminally negligent homicide. Next, it says if you find the defendant not guilty on count 1, manslaughter in the second degree, for the reason that the people have failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not justified, then you must not consider count 2, criminally negligent homicide, and you must also find the defendant not guilty of that. Now, this is just a long way of saying if you find that Daniel Penny was acting in legally justified self-defense, then he can't be guilty of either manslaughter or criminally negligent homicide. Now, last but not least, it says if you find the defendant is not guilty of count 1, manslaughter in the second degree, for some reasons other than lack of justification, self-defense, then you proceed to consider and render a verdict on count 2, criminally negligent homicide. So now that's what the jury did. They went and looked at the manslaughter charge first and couldn't come to an agreement. Matter of fact, they were deadlocked.
Hi, I'm Phil Lipoff. We are following breaking news at this hour. The jury in the trial of Daniel Penny says they are unable to come to a verdict on one of the charges. Penny is charged with manslaughter and negligent homicide in the subway chokehold death of Jordan Neely in New York City. Now, jurors say they cannot reach a decision on that top count, the manslaughter charge.
So now, let me bring it all together. Remember, the judge said you have to evaluate the manslaughter charge first, then you can move to criminally negligent homicide. But since they couldn't come to a decision on the manslaughter charge, what were the judge's options? Well, one, he could declare a mistrial. And by declaring a mistrial, you'd have to do the trial all over again. Now, another option would be dismissing the manslaughter count. But if you dismiss the manslaughter count at this part of the trial, then jeopardy attaches. So he would be acquitted of the manslaughter charge, and you could never bring that back. So the prosecutors in the Manhattan DA's office decided to drop the manslaughter charge, understanding that they would lose that charge forever and just have the jury evaluate criminally negligent homicide.
I'm Selena Wang in Washington, and we begin with some breaking news. The judge of the Daniel Penny's fatal subway chokehold trial in New York City has been dismissed. The top charge has been dismissed of second-degree manslaughter at the request of prosecutors. All of this after jurors reported that they were deadlocked on the second-degree manslaughter charge. They sent a second note repeating that they cannot come to a unanimous conclusion on the count. Penny is also charged with negligent homicide in the death of street performer Jordan Neely.
Now, Jordan Neely's defense team didn't want this dismissal. They said, no, you should hold them to the top count. If they can't reach a verdict on the top count, then we want a mistrial. Where the prosecutor was like, hey, we'll give up the top count and see if we can get a compromise verdict on the criminally negligent homicide.
Prosecutor comes and says, get rid of the first charge. So now the judge says, come back Monday, deliberate on the second lesser charge, criminally negligent homicide. The judge told the jurors, what I'm going to do is this manslaughter in the second degree is dismissed. Remember, the DA was okay with this, so why do you ever charge him with it in the first place? You are now free to consider count 2. Whether that makes any difference, I have no idea, but I direct you to focus deliberations on count 2, render a verdict on that one. The defense then asked for a mistrial, strongly objected to the dismissal of the charge, right? Saying this was essentially elbowing the jury to reach a compromised verdict. The defense also raised the question of whether or not a juror spoke to the press. Could also be grounds for mistrial.
So now we are back to our friendly chart. And as you can see, the manslaughter in the second degree has now been removed. It's been dismissed. So the prosecution doesn't have to prove that he knew what he was doing was extremely dangerous. But now they only have to prove that he should have known. So they're going to ask the jury to now evaluate, should Daniel Penny have known that what he was doing was dangerous and the fact that someone died from that action? Now, at the end of the day, I think this is going to be a mistrial on the criminally negligent homicide. And here is my reading of the tea leaves. I'm assuming based on the evidence that there are some jurors in that jury room who believe that Daniel Penny was 100% justified and was acting within self-defense. That would mean that for the top count and for the criminally negligent homicide, they would consider him to be not guilty. He was acting in self-defense. And then I also believe that you have some people on that jury pool that believe that Daniel Penny was guilty of manslaughter in the second degree. That's why you didn't have a unanimous verdict. Now, if you remove the manslaughter in the second degree and bring it to criminally negligent homicide, I think both sides don't change, because the people who thought he was guilty of manslaughter, for those same reasons, think he's guilty of criminally negligent homicide. And for the people who thought that he was not guilty of of manslaughter based on self-defense will also have to believe that he's not guilty of criminally negligent homicide based on the self-defense. So now I've seen a lot of confusion about why would the defense team not want the top count to be dropped. And I'll tell you exactly why. See, if you are on that jury and you believe Daniel Penny is guilty of manslaughter, then you obviously think he's guilty of the lesser charge, because to be guilty of the manslaughter, you have to be guilty of criminally negligent homicide. So if we're now going to just look at criminal negligent homicide, my vote for guilty doesn't change. I obviously think he's guilty for criminal negligent homicide because I think he's guilty for the manslaughter. Where if you are not guilty for the manslaughter, you could possibly say, well, I think he is guilty for the criminally negligent homicide, but not the manslaughter. So the defense team is obviously objecting to this because they're saying that the judge is only allowing the prosecutor to get more guilty votes if you have people who are saying, yes, he is not guilty for manslaughter, but I could find him guilty for the lesser charge of criminally negligent homicide. You're not going to logically be able to get people to say, I find him guilty of manslaughter, but not guilty of criminally negligent homicide, when you have to be guilty of criminally negligent homicide to be guilty of manslaughter. So I think with all that said, this is probably going to likely end in a mistrial, and he will not be found guilty on the criminally negligent homicide, because if people believe that he was justified in using self-defense or defending others, then he's not guilty of criminally negligent homicide too. And those who believe he's guilty of the manslaughter also still believe he's guilty of the criminally negligent homicide. So I don't think anything changes, but we will see. The judge is going to give him another week, and then we'll have the final decision. Don't forget, like, share, subscribe, do all that great YouTube stuff. If you enjoyed this video, my name is Nate the Lawyer, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.